In 1605, a group of dissident Catholics came within a whisker of one of the greatest assassination coups in history, blowing up the King of England, James I, and his government as he attended Parliament in London. 36 barrels of gunpowder, approximately 1 ton of explosives, had been placed directly under where he'd be opening Parliament, and experts estimate that no one within 300 feet would have survived the explosion. Had it succeeded, it would have rivaled 9/11 in its audacity, and would have changed English and arguably world history forever. But who were the plotters? What were they trying to achieve? And how close did they really come to success? Were they freedom fighters or 17th century terrorists? And why is only one conspirator, Guy Fawkes, remembered when he wasn't even the brains behind the operation? This is the story of Guy Fawkes and the Gunpowder Plot of 1605. Whilst the Gunpowder Plot was directed at the newly installed Stuart king, James I of England, it very much had its roots in Tudor history. Ever since Henry VIII had broken with the Roman Catholic Church 70 years beforehand, the Catholics in England had been suppressed. Mass could not be legally celebrated, priests were imprisoned or executed, they were seen as agents of a foreign power, the Pope in Rome. The Catholics couldn't have their children legally baptised as Catholics, they couldn't marry as Catholics, and they couldn't die with the Catholic last sacrament. Every person over the age of 16 had to take Protestant communion twice a year. And non-attendance was punishable by a £20 fine, which was a hefty sum. It was akin to something like £3,000 in today's money. Despite that cost, many Catholic nobles chose to pay the fines rather than compromise their religious beliefs. Sir Thomas Tresham, whose family will appear in our story, paid £8,000 in those days' monies in fines. Other Catholics paid lip service to the Anglican doctrine. Sir Richard Sherborne, a Catholic landowner in Lancashire, used to attend Church of England services with his ears stuffed with wool so he couldn't hear the sermons. But Catholics didn't take all this persecution lying down. In 1569, a Catholic rising in the north of England was ruthlessly crushed by Henry VIII's daughter, Elizabeth I. Others conspired to replace Queen Elizabeth with the exiled Catholic Mary Queen of Scots, whose active and rather indiscreet support for their cause would eventually lead to her execution in 1587. Meanwhile, the leader of the Catholic superpower of the day, Philip II of Spain, decided that if the English Catholics couldn't bring about a regime change from within, then he would do so from without. But his mighty invasion force, the Spanish Armada, was defeated in 1588. Now, these foreign interventions, supposedly on behalf of the English Catholics, put them in a precarious position. Not only did they support the Pope over the Queen as their spiritual head, but they were now perceived by many in England as a fifth column, happy to support an invasion by a foreign Catholic power. With penal oppression and that accusation of being friends of England's enemies, they had to tread a careful line. Some Catholic peers claimed that they had a duty to support the Pope if he came to England in peace, but would fight him for the King or Queen if he came in war. But above all, Catholics placed their hopes in a change of policy after Elizabeth had finally passed away. Now in her late 60s and suffering from declining health, Queen Elizabeth I had no children. Both her siblings had died childless, so the succession was in a state of flux. Her father, Henry VIII, had had 2 sisters, both long gone. The elder of the 2, Margaret Tudor, married King James IV of Scotland. Her granddaughter was Mary Queen of Scots. And Mary's son was the current King of Scotland, James VI. He was the first in line to the English throne, but he wasn't assured of the crown. For a start, James was a foreigner. And not just any old foreigner, he was a Scot, and there was historic anti-Scottish feeling in England. In fact, so much so that Henry VIII himself had decreed that Margaret Tudor's offspring, as foreign Scots, were barred from the line of succession. After the death of her husband, Margaret remarried, and from this union she had a great-granddaughter, Lady Arabella Stuart, who was the cousin of James VI of Scotland. Lady Arabella had been born in England and was residing with her formidable grandmother, Bess of Hardwicke, at Hardwicke Hall in Derbyshire. She was a rival claimant because although she was descended from Margaret, she was, crucially, English. Meanwhile, Henry VIII had recognised the line of succession through his younger sister. Her granddaughter was Lady Jane Grey, but that's for another story. Whilst one of Lady Jane Grey's sisters had had a son, and he is alive and well at this point in our story, Edward Seymour, Lord Beauchamp. Based upon Henry VIII's order of succession, Edward's line hadn't been barred, and he was English too, making him a potential claimant for the throne against James Stuart up in Scotland. For the English Catholics, the problem was that apart from the confusion about exactly where the crown would land, seeing as the ageing Queen Elizabeth refused to actually name a successor, all of these candidates that I've just mentioned were Protestants. Catholics were desperate, and in fact they looked across the English Channel to the Archduchess Isabella, daughter of Philip II of Spain, currently Regent of the Spanish Netherlands, modern-day Belgium. As a descendant of King Edward III of England, she did have a far-off claim to the English throne. Admittedly, her claim was a lot further than James of Scotland or Lady Arabella Stuart or Lord Beauchamp, but Isabella did have some things going for her. Firstly, she was a Catholic. Secondly, her brother was the king of the superpower, Spain. Isabella had been ruling the Spanish Netherlands on his behalf, so she actually had a proven track record of ruling a country. And finally, she was sitting just across the English Channel with a Spanish army behind her. And therein was her problem as far as the rest of England were concerned. She was Catholic and she was Spanish. And if the English didn't like the Scots, they really didn't like the Spanish, which is hardly surprising seeing as the Armada had only been 10 years beforehand. And there was one final problem. Isabella was childless. In other words, the Catholics, and indeed the rest of England, would have come full circle and would be exactly where they are now. No clear successor, and as far as the Catholics were concerned, no Catholic dynasty. Up in Scotland, James was worried about those potential rivals, not least his cousin Arabella Stuart, and also worried about the Catholic threat represented by Isabella. And so he decided to play a canny game with the Pope in Rome. He started to make a few noises about his interest in Catholicism. After all, his mother, Mary Queen of Scots, was a Catholic, and his wife, Anne of Denmark, had recently converted. He claimed he had no love for the Calvinist Protestants who had pushed him around as the child king in Scotland. The Pope was delighted with this potential convert, especially if he could bring England back to Catholicism without any military intervention. And so Pope Clement offered to champion him against all the other contenders, including Isabella. Catholics in England now started to see James as their great hope for either a full Catholic restoration or at least some form of toleration. In 1603, on her deathbed, Queen Elizabeth finally signalled that James should be her successor, and upon her death, he was proclaimed King James I of England. The excitement amongst England's Catholics would soon turn to disappointment. James had never seriously contemplated converting to Rome. What he was serious about was making sure that he would wear the crown of England. In his very first parliament in England in early 1604, less than a year after becoming king, he spent most of his energies on trying to unify England and Scotland, rather than reaching any form of Catholic toleration. In fact, even more anti-Catholic legislation was passed by the king, as he sought to keep the vested interests in his new kingdom of England on his side. To English Catholics, it was clear that nothing was going to change. And so, a group of provincial Catholic gentlemen decided to take dramatic action. If the king would not change things, they would change the king. Their leader was 32-year-old Robert Catesby, a fiery Catholic crusader whose aunt was Sir Thomas Tresham's wife. That's Sir Thomas Tresham who paid those £8,000 of fines. He gathered around him a small group of conspirators, mainly in their 30s, from around the English Midlands, with close family connections to each other. For a start, there were his second cousins, Francis Tresham, and Robert and Thomas Winter, and their brother-in-law, John Grant. Brothers Jack and Christopher, or Kit, Wright, and their brother-in-law, Thomas Percy, a distant relative of the Earl of Northumberland, the leading Catholic peer, and Percy's servant, Thomas Bates. Also in this revolutionary cell was Robert Keyes, who would later introduce his cousin's husband, Ambrose Rookwood, to the conspiracy. Rookwood, in his mid-20s, would be joined by another man of similar age, Sir Digby Everard. Everard had travelled 3 times to Scotland before Elizabeth's death, trying to persuade James to adopt a more tolerant attitude when he became king, but to no avail, and now Everard felt bitterly betrayed. To this tight little group bound by family bonds was added one outsider, Guy Fawkes. Fawkes was a 34-year-old Yorkshireman who had converted to Catholicism in his late teens. Well-built, with thick reddish-brown hair and beard, he had travelled to the Spanish Netherlands and had served in the Catholic army, fighting both against the Protestant Dutch and then against the Catholic French. He had participated in the capture of Calais from the French by the Spanish in the 1590s, where he had gained considerable experience in combat in general, and more particularly in explosives. And he had started to go by a new name, Guido Fawkes. Fellow conspirator Tom Winter travelled to Spain lobbying for support towards a regime change, and he obtained a vague promise of help in the future. Believing that he had a done deal, this news was conveyed to Catesby, but the conspirators were not aware that the political landscape in Europe was changing. Queen Elizabeth's nemesis, Philip II of the Spanish Armada, had passed away a few years before the Queen, and his son, Philip III, was adopting a totally different strategy. France, not England, were his new enemy, and he was keen to remove that English threat with a peace treaty. Whilst he undoubtedly would love England to come back to the Roman Church, he wasn't willing to spend Spanish blood or even Spanish money to achieve that. Unbeknown to Catesby, the conspirators in England were on their own. On Sunday the 20th of May 1604, Catesby, Guy Fawkes and 3 other conspirators met in the Duck and Drake Inn on the Strand in London to hammer out their plan of action. And the plan was as simple as it was audacious. They would blow up the king when he attended Parliament, as they called it, that place that has done us so much mischief. King James, his wife, his son and heir, Prince Henry, the House of Lords with all the leading nobility of England and the bishops of the Church of England would be blown sky high. The explosion would be a signal for a Catholic rising in the Midlands, where they would seize James's daughter, Princess Elizabeth, who was currently living at Combe Abbey just outside Coventry, and make her a puppet queen, with the leading Catholic peer, Percy's distant relative, the Earl of Northumberland, acting as her regent. Interestingly, they never seemed to let Northumberland actually in onto their plans, although his family relationship to Percy and his planned role would be enough to land him in prison at a later stage. And finally, the conspirators would call in the Spanish military assistance that they believed they'd been promised. In March 1605, Percy secured a lease on a cellar inside the Palace of Westminster, where Parliament would meet. Whilst it's called a cellar, it was actually at ground floor level and was part of the great medieval kitchen of the palace. And whilst an outsider hiring a cellar in the Palace of Westminster might seem a bit weird in this modern day and age, at the time there were houses, there were merchants, there were taverns all residing in the palace, so hiring a cellar wasn't as surprising as it probably would be today. Directly above this cellar was the chamber where the House of Lords would meet, with the King presiding, on the 5th of November 1605. Guy Fawkes, under the alias of John Johnson, carefully transported 36 barrels of gunpowder from Catesby's house across the River Thames to the cellar inside the Palace of Westminster, where he hid it under bundles of firewood. In June 1605, Catesby confided to a Jesuit priest, Father Garnet, by way of confession, that he'd be willing to kill innocents for the cause of restoring the Catholic faith in England. Garnet later claimed that there was no mention of either the king or of gunpowder, but he would always be accused of not stopping Catesby, and it would seal his doom. And then, with just 10 days to go, things started to unravel. On the 26th of October, Catholic peer Lord Monteagle received a handwritten message that had been passed to his servant by a stranger in the street. The note advised him to be absent from Parliament and to retire to the safety of his country estate, stating somewhat cryptically, "They shall receive a terrible blow, yet they shall not see who hurts them." Monteagle took the letter to Robert Cecil, Lord Salisbury, the Secretary of State, an arch anti-Catholic. Cecil deduced from the message that an explosion was planned, and as Monteagle had been advised to stay away from the opening of Parliament, it was obvious both where and when this explosion would take place, What he didn't know at this stage were any of the finer details, or that it was a Catholic conspiracy, nor did he know the conspirators' names or their plans post the plot. Salisbury decided to let the plot, to use his words, ripen. In the meantime, word got back to Catesby about the Monteagle letter. Who could have betrayed the plot? He suspected Francis Tresham, but Tresham swore his innocence. Maybe it was a priest, like Father Garnet. He even wondered if it was Thomas Percy. But why would Percy choose to alert Monteagle and not his relative, the Earl of Northumberland? To this day, we do not know who betrayed the conspirators. But with Cecil on the scent, the plotters had 10 days to save themselves. But apart from questioning Tresham, Catesby didn't flinch. It was full steam ahead. On the 30th of October, just 6 days before Parliament was due to meet, Fawkes checked that the gunpowder was in place and reported that everything was set to go. Sunday the 3rd of November, just 2 days to go, Catesby, Winter and Percy met again in London and decided that despite urgings from Tresham, they would continue. Late on the morning of the 4th of November, with just 24 hours to go, Percy visited his relative Northumberland under the guise of wanting a loan. What he really wanted to do was hear if the Earl had got wind of the Monteagle letter. He hadn't. That evening at 6 p.m, Percy assured the conspirators that all was well, and Catesby, accompanied by Jack Wright and the servant Thomas Bates, set off by horse for the Midlands to prepare for the rising. At 10 o'clock that night, Fawkes visited Robert Keyes, who gave him a watch, left by Percy, to time the fuses in the Palace of Westminster. Unbeknown to Fawkes and the other conspirators, Cecil was hot on their trail. The Palace of Westminster had been searched that very day, but nothing had been found. So Fawkes returned to Westminster with his watch to prepare his fuse late that night. They were just 12 hours away from the biggest explosion London had ever seen. And then, just after midnight on the 5th of November 1605, guards entered the cellar, and there they found a tall man in a cloak and dark hat, booted and spurs, amidst 36 barrels of gunpowder. It was Fawkes. Arrested on the spot, Fawkes claimed that he was John Johnson, a servant of Thomas Percy, a story that he was to keep up for the next 48 hours. A warrant was now issued for Thomas Percy, but the authorities went to the wrong address, enabling him to make his escape, along with Kit Wright. As dawn rose on the 5th of November 1605, the news was spreading through the capital, and London was in turmoil. The conspirators still left in London fled. Ambrose Rookwood sped north, a talented rider with quality horses which he had previously left at intervals along the route north. He swiftly caught up with Catesby and broke the bad news. There would be no explosion. The conspirators rode together to rendezvous with Digby at Dunchurch in Warwickshire, just 12 miles from Combe Abbey, home of Princess Elizabeth. The explosion might not have happened, but there could still be a Catholic rising, and Princess Elizabeth could still be abducted. Catesby decided to brazen it out, and actually announced to Catholics gathered at Digby's house that Parliament had been blown up, the King was dead, and he encouraged them to join his rising. Despite his charisma and his monumental news, only a few joined his ranks. Meanwhile, that night, Londoners were permitted to light bonfires to celebrate saving the King. Angry demonstrations took place outside the residence of the Spanish ambassador, who swiftly lit his own bonfire in celebration and then threw money to the crowd. And so he might, because he would have been in Parliament when it went up as well. Fawkes, or John Johnson as he was claiming to be, was hauled in front of the King, where he showed no remorse, and boldly stated that he wanted to blow the Scottish King and his Scottish lords all the way back to Scotland. King James ordered him to the Tower of London, and authorised him to be tortured, using the rack. John Johnson cracked on the 7th of November and revealed his true name. And a day later, the 8th of November, Fawkes finally gave the names of his fellow conspirators. The faint scrawl of his signature on his confession bears witness to his trauma that his body must have suffered as he endured 3 days of torture. With the names of the conspirators in Cecil's hands, the manhunt across England was now on. Catesby's Midland Rising was dead in the water. Princess Elizabeth had been raced to safety in Coventry, where the town's gates had been shut. The conspirators now raided Warwick Castle, obtaining some horses and gunpowder, before fleeing to a variety of Catholic stately homes through Warwickshire and Worcestershire. They finally arrived at Holbeach House near King Swinford in Staffordshire on the afternoon of the 6th of November, during a heavy downpour of rain. The rebel army of just 36 men were wet through, as indeed was their supply of gunpowder, which they now, somewhat bizarrely, tried to dry in front of the open fire. Catesby got his explosion, except it wasn't the king who was blown up, but his own men. Thomas Winter arrived just after the explosion to find John Grant badly disfigured and Catesby and Rookwood injured. Most of the other rebels had melted away, along indeed with Robert Winter, Digby, and the servant Thomas Bates. All that remained of Catesby's army were the two Wright brothers, Thomas Percy, Tom Winter, and the injured Grant, Rookwood, and Catesby himself. 2 days later, on the 8th of November, at 11 o'clock in the morning, 200 men loyal to the king arrived and surrounded the house. In a brief shootout, Catesby and Percy were somewhat bizarrely killed by the same musket ball. The Wright brothers also died in the shootout. Rookwood, Tom Winter, and Grant were captured. Across England, the other conspirators were hunted down and taken to the Tower of London, although Robert Winter managed to stay at liberty for 2 months. During interrogation at the Tower of London, the servant Bates reported that Catesby had met priests and had confided with the Jesuit priest, Father Garnet. This was the evidence that Cecil wanted. In his mind, this wasn't a plot by some disgruntled provincial Catholics. This was a plot orchestrated by servants of the Pope. Warrants were issued for Garnet and 2 other priests, and on the 27th of January, Father Garnet surrendered, having spent 8 days hidden in a priest hole. On the very day that Father Garnet was captured, the trial of the surviving conspirators began in Westminster Hall. Francis Tresham had died in custody, which at least saved him the grisly fate that would await the rest of the conspirators. It was a trial in name only. There was only ever going to be one verdict, and the Lord Chief Justice declared them guilty of treason. The gunpowder plotters were executed within a week. Pulled through the streets of London, strapped on a wicker hurdle behind a horse to their place of execution, they received the punishment of a traitor's death, being hanged, drawn, and quartered. The worst death for the worst possible crime. The grisly process started with being hanged until almost dead and then cut down. Then you were castrated to end your lineage. The next step was their heart was cut out and held aloft by the executioner, who shouted, "Behold the heart of a traitor!" This was followed by disembowelment while still alive, if they'd managed to survive the ordeal that far, before finally being beheaded and their body hacked into quarters. And those quarters, along with their heads, were displayed in public as a warning to others. Digby, Robert Winter, John Grant and Thomas Bates were executed on the 30th of January, 1606, in St. Paul's churchyard. The following day, Tom Winter, Rookwood, Keyes and Guy Fawkes were executed in the Old Palace Yard at Westminster, in the same complex that they had intended to blow up. Fawkes was so weak that his neck snapped at the first stage, which was probably a welcome release. So were Guy Fawkes and his fellow conspirators terrorists or freedom fighters? Well, who were they acting for? The gunpowder plot was a very English affair. Catesby, Fawkes and the other conspirators were not acting on behalf of any foreign Catholic power, and they certainly were not acting with the authority of the Roman Catholic Church, as the Pope still hoped that James would convert without the need for bloodshed. Philip III of Spain, while sympathetic to the idea of a Catholic England, was far more concerned with squaring up to France than reigniting his father's long-running and financially ruinous ambitions for England. And accepting that the majority of English men and women were reasonably happy with the Protestant ascendancy, the conspirators certainly cannot claim to be acting for the general population. They were acting for a Catholic minority. And it was a minority. Professor John Bosey estimates that maybe 40,000 Catholics in England were secretly using the services of a Catholic priest, which equates to about 1% of the total population. And even though others might have been pretend Protestants, there is no way that we can reasonably think that they were remotely close to half of the population. And it would be wrong to assume that the conspirators were acting for all Catholics. Many wanted to quietly get on with their lives without drawing attention to themselves, Witness the Earl of Northumberland and Lord Monteagle, for starters. And the fact that there was no mass uprising, even in the conspirators' Midland heartlands, is indicative of the lack of enthusiasm that Catholics in England had for violent change. Which leads to another question. What did they actually hope to achieve? Well, quite frankly, this is a bit of an unknown. Catesby wanted to blow up the King and Parliament, but to what end? He never articulated it. Realistically, there were really only four options. 1. That England readopted Roman Catholicism as the state religion. To achieve that, they would need a Catholic monarch. Isabella, regent of the Spanish Netherlands, maybe? Well, maybe, but she hadn't been invited. Princess Elizabeth, abducted and indoctrinated? Maybe. Any radical replacement like this would require a military force to counter the Protestant population, not to mention some very angry Scots who had just seen their king, James VI, blown to kingdom come by some English Catholics. And it's quite apparent that Catesby could not muster such an army. Nor was there one ready to go in either the Spanish Netherlands or Spain itself. Option 2 was some form of toleration, similar to that enjoyed by the Protestants in Catholic France with the recent Edict of Nantes. The problem was that the Roman Catholic Church was not interested in being tolerated in a Protestant country. The hierarchy in Rome saw themselves as the true religion. So why did they need to be tolerated? So whilst local Catholics in England might have welcomed toleration, it wouldn't have had the blessing of Rome. So would they have actually gone rogue? The third option was merely to have all anti-Catholic penal laws repealed. Great idea, but you would need Parliament to agree to reverse those laws. A Parliament who, number 1, had just been attacked by Catholics, and 2, represented the angry Protestant majority of the country. I guess you could somehow dissolve Parliament and then call a new Parliament filled with Catholics, if you could find enough Catholics to fulfil that role, and if you had military support to dissolve Parliament in the first place. Finally, we could have ended up in some sort of good old-fashioned English fudge, where the laws remained, they just weren't enforced. Which really fundamentally produced a constitutional problem, that the judiciary would be encouraged to ignore the law-making body of Parliament. Not only would this create chaos, but of course it would also set dangerous precedents for the future. So exactly who they were representing and what their end goal really was are open to the debates of history. Which leads us to another question. How close did the conspirators really come to pulling off the most audacious assassination in history, or certainly in British history? Well, they did place 36 barrels of gunpowder directly under the hall where Parliament would meet, and Fawkes was captured less than 12 hours before that assembly. In 2005, a documentary for ITV carried out a reconstruction of the gunpowder explosion. Explosive experts estimated that the 36 barrels were equivalent to about 1 ton of explosives, and when they were detonated, the experts were shocked by the devastation. It seems that the barrels funneled the force of the explosions upwards, rather like a cannon, or in this case 36 cannon, ripping through the House of Lords above it. From the destruction that ensued, they concluded that no one within 100 metres, or about 350 feet, would have survived the full impact of the explosion. And while some people have questioned whether the gunpowder being used by Fawkes may have decayed, those explosive experts had actually, in the reconstruction, had deliberately mixed decayed gunpowder in their explosives, and the result was nevertheless devastating. It seems that Fawkes' experience of explosives and that upward blast created from the barrels would have achieved the conspirators' aim of blowing up the king and Parliament. But what would have happened then? I mean, no foreign power was on hand to assist, and assembling an invasion force would have taken time and was subject to the weather around the British coastline. And there was no obvious Catholic rising in the Midlands when initially told by Catesby that the plot had actually succeeded. Maybe more Catholics would have come out of the woodwork as news spread of the explosion, but that's not guaranteed. And it's arguable whether they would have had the numbers or the weaponry to win the inevitable civil war with the Protestants that would have ensued. Most Catholic sympathising peers would have been in the House of Lords, so there would have been a power vacuum in Britain, which could have been just as easily filled by hardline Protestants, Puritans, Calvinists, as by Catholics. The likely reality at the end of it all would have been a bloody civil war between the Protestants and the Catholics, in which the Catholics would, in all likelihood, have lost. And whilst the planned explosion was just hours away, Robert Cecil, Lord Salisbury, had been aware of it 10 days beforehand. It's no coincidence that the cellars had been searched twice on the days of the 4th and 5th of November. So here's an interesting question. Was the plot really a put-up job by Cecil to increase his own power? Many have thought so. The new king was already suspicious of his Catholic subjects, and what better way for an arch-anti-Catholic Cecil to cement his power within the court than by getting the king to fear an assassination attempt by the Catholics? James's own father, Lord Darnley, had been killed in an explosion, so gunpowder would have been a powerful emotional lever for Cecil to pull. Interestingly, despite knowing about the plans for 10 days, Cecil allowed the plans for the opening of Parliament to proceed. The nobility of England were arriving in London for the event, as indeed were the royal family, so Cecil was either cutting it very close, or he knew that it would always be discovered in the nick of time. If the gunpowder plot was an elaborate conspiracy by Cecil to increase his power, certainly none of the conspirators were given any special treatment by him. And indeed, none of them indicated that anyone outside of their tight circle knew about the plot. So, despite it being an intriguing theory, there's no firm evidence that Cecil was behind the plot. At the end of the day, Cecil was a political animal, and it's just as likely that he was simply an opportunist rather than an orchestrator. But we will never really know. Which leads us to one final question. What did the conspirators actually achieve? Well, whilst Parliament and the King weren't blown sky high, the fallout of the gunpowder plot unleashed a persecution on England's Catholics. Even before the trial of the conspirators, King James was referring to his Catholic subjects as his ungrateful Catholics. And in 1606, a new Act of Parliament introduced yet another oath of allegiance to the King over the Pope. But the persecutions went further. Catholics could no longer practice in the law, or serve as officers in the army or navy, nor could they act as an executor of a will, or be the guardian of a minor, or possess a weapon, or vote in local elections. It wasn't until 1791 that Catholics were allowed to practice their religion without penalty, and only in 1829, over 200 years later, that they would be allowed to vote in parliamentary elections, which is a heck of a price to pay for the failed plot of 1605. But the gunpowder plot achieved something else. It created the traditional bonfire night celebrations, complete with fireworks and guys, that last in Britain to this day. As I said earlier, bonfires were encouraged to be lit in London on the very night of the plot, the 5th of November 1605, and they've continued ever since. Effigies of Guy Fawkes were burnt on the bonfires, although over the years other characters have ended up on the 5th of November bonfires too. The ultimate irony about the guys on the bonfires was that Guy Fawkes was never actually burned. Bonfire night is also marked in Britain, of course, by firework displays. And it's interesting that the first recorded fireworks being let off in celebration on the 5th of November were recorded by Samuel Pepys just 60 years after the plot. To this very day, Parliament is still searched on the eve of opening of Parliament by the yeomen of the guard, who then proceed to drink a toast to the monarch. As a terrorist plot, it ranks right up there with 9/11. But just like 9/11, it had no realistic post-strategy. In the end, it achieved nothing positive, but it did fuel an anti-Catholic backlash that lasted 200 years. It's interesting that whilst a handful of years are remembered, such as 1066, very few actual days are remembered in English history. One stands out all by itself. Remember, remember, the 5th of November. Gunpowder, treason and plot. And so on the 5th of November, we remember Guy Fawkes, as one wag put it, the only man to get into Parliament with the right intentions. Thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed that video and found the story interesting. Don't forget to give me a like, and how about joining my History Chap Supporters Club? What's that all about? Well, click on the link that's going to appear in a moment. Loads more videos coming your way, but in the meantime, keep well, and I'll see you very soon.